Welcome to another episode of Phrasally Verbocious. This week, something a little bit different. I'm interviewing Alan. Alan has recently embarked on his master's dissertation and also recently given a presentation on emotional intelligence at ELT Ireland. So I'm interviewing him about the importance of this topic and what it means to us in the classroom. So, Alan, why emotional intelligence? What got you interested in this topic?
So this was one of those things that just had my interest for a very long time. So a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, I sort of brushed across it on my previous master's, which then became the basis for my literature review for my PhD in affective computing. So a lot of the research on that was psychology, which I find quite interesting because there's so much about the brain we really haven't a clue about, and it's only really started. The research into it. There's behavioral books like Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People from 1936.
A classic book, actually. That's known outside of research stuff.
It is, yeah. It's extremely readable as well. But there's a lot of stuff we literally haven't got a clue about. So I thought it was quite interesting to sort of connect emotional intelligence, the research I'd done on that, and then see how it's used see how I can use it in the classroom. So I went on a deep dive of research. Now, a lot of this is based on the book Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman from '96. But I also looked into the study of mood, which is something not many people actually think about. So mood is the much larger, greater feeling you have over a longer period of time. Robert E. Thayer has written, because he's now dead, a lot of pretty interesting and very readable books on that as well. So if this is...
Just kind of stop you for 1 second, and I know we'll probably come on to this later on, but you just mentioned mood and emotions, and can you just tell us what the difference is, please?
That's a really good question, actually. So mood and emotions are actually two completely different things. So emotions are what you feel in any given point in time. Okay. You can be happy, hungry, sad, whatever. So there's a lot of research into what a mood is. When I was doing my PhD research, the first study was based on arousal and non-arousal. So basically, if you say table, you don't have an opinion on a table. But if you say something like puppies, everybody smiles. So there's arousal and non-arousal, right?
Okay.
So there's a lot of research into what emotions are. There's some studies will claim there's 6. There's German study claims there's 20, but the study the paper that's used the most was from 1980, which is Plutchik, who wrote a Plutchiks Whale of emotions. So in it he says there's 8 major emotions, and every other emotion is just a lesser or more intense experience of that emotional state. So
that's interesting, because I've seen this wheel, and I think it's something. Well, listeners will post links in the show notes, of course. But I think it's a very interesting way of conceptualizing how our emotions relate to one another.
Yeah, and I think one of the important things is the different levels of intensity or different emotions as well. So he says the base level, the sort of 8 neutral main emotions, are joy, trust, fear, surprise, sadness, disgust, anger, and anticipation. So every other emotional state that you've had is either a stronger or less intense version of that. So, a light boredom might be one, whereas angst might be the most intense version of, disgust.
But it's all along one spectrum.
It is, yeah. And then when you're within the 8 most intense emotions, which the graph will be in the show notes, you cannot move from one to the other. You have to go back out this spectrum to be able to change your emotional state.
Can you give us an example of 2 from the inner circle? Just give us 2.
So say, for example, the 8 neutral emotions. So it's the second level of the inner circle. So the base emotion would be sadness. The most intense version of that would be grief.
Okay. And then, so from grief, you couldn't move to...
You could, anger or
Right. Okay.
ecstasy of extreme happiness.
So you have to come out of grief first before you can move.
You do. You have to get yourself to sadness before you can go to, say, joy or surprise or something. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. So that's emotion and mood.
So Robert E. Thayer wrote quite a few interesting books. Again, the books are going to be in the show notes. A couple of interesting books on mood, which he says is much more longitudinal than emotion. So emotion, you could have 3 emotions in the space of 30 seconds. You could be hungry, you could be tired, and you could be, excited if your dog's there. Whereas mood can last weeks at a time. It's the underlying feeling he says it has a greater effect on all activities, money, status, or personal relationships. It's just this background feeling that you will always have.
So could we use as a metaphor then, mood is to weather as... no, sorry, scrap that. Pause.
You mean the thing... Sorry, are you trying to quote me by interviewing me?
Yes, I am. Right, pause. So could we say then that emotions are to weather what mood is to climate?
You could. Because that was actually it's nice to be quoted back to. Yeah. So especially if you think of the Irish weather, mood is the emotion, what climate is the weather. Climate is much more long lasting over a long period of time. Mood, emotion, in Ireland you can have 17 weather systems in a day. You can get sunburnt and frostbite the same day. That's what emotion is. Yeah. It's nice to be quoted back.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's almost as though we've planned this podcast. Okay, so mood and emotion. Why? Okay, I get why you've got a personal interest in the topic. That's quite obvious. But why is it interesting to you in regards to teaching?
I think once you get into the nitty-gritty of classrooms, the more you understand your student at an emotional level, the much more easier it is to get them to learn for classroom behavior and just to have a more... If you're going to spend 90 minutes in a classroom, it's better to have a much more constructive class. I think it's much more important to understand where everybody's coming from. Now, you and me worked in an academy where we did parent-teacher parent-teacher meetings. February, was it?
Yeah, around Carnival time. So we'd have we wouldn't teach a class to the juniors for the 2 days of Carnival, but parents were welcome to come in and have a chat with the teacher about what was going on. Yeah,
and that was one of the things that once I'd met the teachers, a lot more of the student made sense, if that makes sense.
Once you met the parents, you mean?
Yeah, once you've met the parents, so much makes sense with the child, and sometimes not even the child, sometimes the teenager. You have these delightful parents, so you have these delightful students, whereas some of the other students might be they might need attention a lot more, and maybe you get that from how the parent interacts with you as well. So I think there's
also, to an extent, seeing parents interacting with their kids in your classroom as well. I mean, kids are always funny when they're with their teacher and their parent at the same time because they really don't know what's going on. But just seeing how the parents interact with their kids can also shed light on how the kids interact with you, because we're all shaped by our experiences, and especially our formative experiences with our parents and families. I think it's also interesting, sort of worth pointing out as well, is that and again, those that do show. Those that do make sure that report cards are signed and returned back, those that maybe have other things going on. I think it's not a case of necessarily blaming parents. I think it's important to state that, because that's not what you mean, right?
Yeah, obviously.
But if there's a lot, of course.
You see the child in the background. Way.
Yeah, exactly. And I think my experiences of teaching in high school in the UK, and I was teaching in quite deprived areas, or areas with lots of social issues going on in the background. And when I've got a kid that can't be held for detention at the age of 12 because he's the one that cares for his younger sister after school, when you have that information in your head, the way you see that kid's very different.
Yeah, it changes completely.
And that was because the situation there was a single mother who was also happened to be very sick. So actually, me trying to get him to understand subordinate clauses in a piece of writing really wasn't his priority.
Yeah.
I mean, it should have been at the age of 12 because he should have been able to go and play, study, and have a great life as a kid. But actually, that wasn't his experience. So it's not useful for me to expect subordinate clauses to be a priority in his life.
I think one of the strange things when you see, I mean, some of the parents come in without the child, but some of the parents do come in with your student. And sometimes, I think this is especially true in sort of young teen classes as opposed to, young learners, is that you see this character, you have this character in your room, they're kids, but they have a personality, they're learning a second language, they're talking to you in a second language. But when they come in with their parents, you see the parent's child as opposed to your student, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. It's true.
Yeah, because
I can relate to that.
Yeah, there's certain students that you and me have had. You had them and then I taught them, or vice versa. And they've come in with the parent, and suddenly they were 3 times smaller, even if they were, my size. It was the strangest thing. So this is why I think it all boils back to emotional intelligence, where there is a human, there is feelings, and there is a brain behind the eyes that you're talking to. And I think it's so important to get into that and not just use that in some way, just to understand it. Because once there's understanding, it's so much easier.
Yeah, I mean, if I may, I'd share another anecdote in terms of understanding and what have you. When I was teaching in Birmingham, and we had a lot of inner city Birmingham, we had a lot of refugees students, and I remember reading a piece of writing written by. Do you know what it was? Actually, it was one of those classic. It was after a classic punishment of letters to the teacher after students have misbehaved.
Mm-hmm.
And I will never forget this letter because this was a student that actually meant the apology. It wasn't just writing a letter and getting it out of the way, because the student really wanted to be a teacher.
Okay.
They really wanted to emulate their... And this probably should come with a trigger warning, actually. They really wanted to emulate a grandfather who was a teacher back in Iraq. Mm-hmm. And the last time this kid saw his grandfather, well, to avoid any triggers, was not in a very good situation. And he shared this with me in this letter. And, he was like, I really do want to pull myself up. I really do want to do better. I really do want to achieve. But this is where I find myself. Mm-hmm. This is what my early childhood contains. So, yeah, it doesn't mean that. I think it was at the understanding, getting inside the mind, realizing there's a human with experiences there. We know this on an intellectual level as teachers. That's why we do it. But actually, that emotional level of just that understanding. Yeah, I agree with you entirely.
Yeah, I think because the both of us have worked with refugees in some shape or form, I think that actually boils down to one of the most important things is we can do all we want or would like to in the classroom, but it doesn't matter if safety isn't there. Because I mean, some of my research went back to research in the brain, and you would think brain research goes back to Freud and all that. No, it doesn't. The research in the brain goes back several hundreds of millions of years.
Hundreds of millions of years.
Yes. Where I'm not a geologist. Who knows? Where so when we were in the process of evolving from whatever we evolved from, the emotional center of the brainstem was created first. And then everything else built around the amygdala and the hippocampus.
Right.
Sorry, I just have to get this out of the way. Do you know what the hippocampus is called after?
Well, I do, but I feel like you want to share it.
I know, because I love this. It's named after and looks like a seahorse. So if you take the hippocampus out of someone's brain, 1, you've really pissed them off, and 2, you've got a little seahorse in your hand. So basically, when the amygdala and the hippocampus of the brainstem were the first things to be created, and then everything else came after it. So your emotions came, first. Millions of years before the rest of the brain did. So I think it's incredibly important because like we were talking about refugees there, and actually if you get stressed out, and if we say the phrase you can't think straight, you literally cannot think straight at times, because stress can create this static in the front part of your frontal lobes in your brain. So there's no ability to write memory, there's no ability to process thought, there's no ability to think logically at all. So if that neural static is there, you're not going to learn a thing anyway. So you're better off getting that static in some way out of the brain so you can actually learn constructively.
Shall we turn to the practical?
We can, yeah.
Because I know you had some fun with a group that I taught before you.
Yes, these were actually great. I love doing this. So basically,
also in a way, actually, was it not teaching this group that kind of turned you onto this in your current research way, or is that my misinterpretation?
They were, well, I had just to explain this, because you had one of the classes. So each day I had on Mondays and Tuesdays, which then repeated on Wednesday, Thursdays. I had two classes, one of all boys teenagers on Mondays and Wednesdays, which you had. And then the other class was all girls at the same level the very next day. Both of these classes became my guinea pigs. So basically I tested so much in the classroom with those guys, but they were great. They genuinely took an interest in it.
What sort of age are we talking?
What would they have been? 12, 13?
Yeah.
At the time, yeah. Because you had them the year before, didn't you?
That's right.
Yeah. But they were fantastic. But the funny thing was, at the start of the year in August, when you're handed the timetable, I was like, all boys, 13-year-olds. This isn't going to be pretty. They were both my favorite two classes all year, which is, really cool. Genuinely loved them. But anyway, the scenario, just to be very clear, was there were all 10 students. There were all boys in that class. To our class, so 12 to 15, they were either strong A2 or B1 level. And what they had done, they had just finished school. They had gone to their respective sports clubs. Then they came to the academy via the sweet shop, which was on the street just in front of the academy. So you can imagine the amount of problems I was planning for all year. Not just the sweat, not just the fact that they were buzzing from all the sports. They were also buzzing from the sugar, which then meant 45 minutes into class, they had the sugar downer, which I had to deal with as well. So I thought this was a good class to try a lot of things on.
Okay.
So I actually did a class on emotional intelligence with them. So we brainstormed all the emotions on the board, which perfectly enough fitted in somewhere on the graph of Plutchiks Whale. So we explained the whole thing of what it was. And the fact that what I think is quite important too is you don't have an emotional connection to emotional vocabulary in your second language.
Okay.
So you do have to do a lot of the class for us, it was monolingual class, so everybody spoke Spanish. So a lot of the class did have to be done in Spanish as well. So they make an emotional connection to the vocabulary I'm using. Otherwise, I was wasting time.
That makes sense.
There's a lot of really cool moralities and emotional connections in L2 research as well that goes into this. But I think the most
links to that.
Oh yeah, all this will be in the show notes. So basically, we did most of the class was on emotional intelligence. So everything was done in Spanish. We then translated it into English, so everybody understood it. I then introduced the idea of meditation in the classroom again through Spanish, which then went into English. I told them why, the science behind it. So you're focusing on one thing, you're taking deep breaths, so the oxygen is going around your body better, it's getting into your brain better, and therefore you're automatically more relaxed. Now, what I did was we took the GoPros, which we had in the academy, and I recorded the class before I did any of this. I recorded the class where I did the emotional intelligence class. And then, so for the rest of the year, the first 5 minutes of class was meditation, and then we did the class.
Go ahead
And then a month.
Second. No, stop there. Right. 10, 12, 13-year-old boys.
Yep.
Meditating for 5 minutes at the beginning of an English language class.
Yep. Now, this was the end, right? Yeah, I know. You're thinking the exact same thing that I was back then. It's very easy to say, well, what if one of the students doesn't buy into this? Or what if 3 or 4 of them doesn't buy into this? Yeah, because you're probably thinking of the names as well. But
I'm seeing the faces. I'm seeing the faces.
Yeah, exactly.
Go on.
But the thing is,
tell me wrong.
The more you keep at it, it's almost like the film 12 Angry Men. The more you keep at it, you get to the rest of the room.
Okay.
And I genuinely get where you're coming from. And I was 13-year-old boys, wise up, not going to happen. See, to be honest with you, after 2 weeks of doing this in the classroom, they were volunteering to lead the meditation. So basically what I did in the class, everybody was sitting down. Now, because of security in the classroom, they either have the choice of closing their eyes or looking at a spot on the ceiling. If they don't want to close their eyes, that's fine. Then they focus on the breathing. So you work them through taking deep breaths, deep breath in, deep breath out, focus on the air going up your nose and coming out your mouth. And then you tell them about their arms and their legs getting more relaxed, that kind of thing. You keep it going. And then you ask everybody afterwards, how do you feel? And everybody feels a lot better. They're a lot calmer, quieter, and we're able to get on with class. 3 weeks later, the students were asking me, can we lead the meditation? And they did. So we actually had a rota of who was coming in that day to lead the meditation. All I did for the first 10 minutes in class was take a register. That was it. The rest of them did it. It was phenomenal, which is another part of emotional intelligence because they're taking it on themselves. So it was like 2 victories in 1. So when we were talking about the GoPro there, I actually recorded a class about a month later to test, had it worked at all?
To sit back and watch it a bit more objectively.
Yeah, exactly. And I couldn't believe the difference it made in the class. And I swear that class actually became one of my favorite classes of the year. I just thought they were brilliant.
It's really interesting.
But you do have to set aside almost an entire class to explain it all in their native language first. Yeah. And it does have to be in their native language because if it isn't, they're not going to make that emotional connection to the vocabulary you're using. Yeah. Because there is a lot of research behind you don't have any emotional connection to any words in a second language take you, for example, if you phone me, and I actually did talk about this in my conference presentation. If you phone me...
You quoted me.
I did, yeah. And you've just quoted me in this podcast.
Oh, dear.
I know. I actually had a slide where it was someone shouting the phrase, come here to me. Right?
Right.
So you say, because you've been around a lot of Irish teachers, you hear the phrase, come here to me, and you just take it as getting our attention or a way of saying, can I speak to you, right?
Yeah.
But the emotional connection I have to that phrase is my grandmother shouting at me when I was 5 years old. Because the very next sentence I expect to hear is, look at the state of your school trousers. You've been out playing football in the muck again. That's what I expect to hear. So I still have that emotional connection to that phrase.
Right. It's a bit like...
We've got to be aware of teaching this.
I'm just thinking of picking up a cat by the scruff of its neck and the way it instantly goes into that kitten pose.
Yeah, exactly. Because that's how they were picked up as kittens. Yeah.
By their mother. That's really interesting.
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy for what it is. Yeah.
Yeah. I think another example I'm going to take, because I can do this from the outside, is actually an Irishman's reaction to the word notions, which means nothing to a British person.
Notions?
Notions.
As in, you took a wee notion or something?
No, as in you've got notions.
Right.
So it means nothing to me as a British person, but when I see, jokingly Irish people sparring and one of them talks about something for example, herbal tea as opposed to normal breakfast tea, and the other one says, "Oh, you've got notions you have," and you can see the horror across the face of the person who enjoys a nice rooibos tea, but has realised that back home in Ireland they would be cast aside for having notions. I think that's a really interesting sort of even.
It's brilliant.
But it also shows not only does it have this emotional connection, but actually, even though we share an L1, even though I know what the word notion means, notions means nothing to me.
Yeah.
And like come here to me means that I get the attention of any Irish person within my within the range of hearing. If I say something like, "Oh, we've got notions," I know I can also sort of admit a bit of control there. Which is kind of funny.
I hadn't thought of that one. That one's good. Yeah, I can see.
Yeah, it's very true.
He's got notions. Yeah. You've been cast aside. Yeah.
Right.
Living with the banshees in the forest.
Come here to me, Alan. The teaching them about the emotions, teaching them about the wheel, getting them in touch with this, getting them to meditate. Is there anything else practical that I can or should be doing in my classroom to better work with emotions?
One of the really important things is getting them to be self-aware. So a whole part of emotional intelligence is self-awareness, both in yourself and empathy for others, which is really difficult to do irregardless. It doesn't matter about different languages. That is a really tough thing
that's
to do.
Difficult.
But what I like to do, and I have done this for a few years now with, I've got to be honest, quite a lot of success, is actually on your walls around the room, instead of having, the textbooks, posters that's supplied with you or whatever, have a list of the class students, and for each class, get them to grade themselves. Get them to grade their learning and their behavior and their actions in the classroom. So they actually go, I've had a good day, or I've not been great today, or I've actually had a bad day. And then so over time you get this view on the board or view on the wall of how each student is doing. So for example, with teens, I'm going to go a bit Irish here. For teens, I have, so you get names down the left and then the dates of the classes. I like to do it per term because it's just easier instead of the entire year, because that would take half the wall. So for teens, they get certain symbols in a little box beside their name. So if you get a tick if you've been grand. Again, one of those Irish words, everything's grand. You get a B for behavior. So if someone sort of steps out of line and wasn't too great, they get a B. A for absent. That's nobody's fault. It's just to remind you that they were absent. S I use for now, because we are both quite happy with L1 in the classroom, like teachers should be. I have an S for excessive use of Spanish when not necessary. E for excellent, because you have to be better than grand sometimes. But like grand is like the base level of everything's okay. And then P is for when people use their phone when it wasn't required. So this is just a thing I like to do at the end of every class, just to get students to be aware of how they've acted or reacted in class.
And are they grading themselves, or are you doing this?
They're doing it, but you can say if you agree or disagree. So at the end of every class, it's you're having a conversation with everyone down the list. Now, we have classes of 10, 12, so it's easy to do and very quick. So if somebody says grand, you can go, I agree. Or if someone says, I was a wee bit misbehaving, you probably were. If someone says they're absent, they're probably not aware of what absent means.
Or maybe they're very aware of what absent means.
They could be. I'd be a bit worried.
They're present but absent.
Exactly.
That's cool. That reminds me of something that we had when we were doing our planning some while ago, and we were talking about emotions being something we wanted to talk about. I was teaching emotions to my 10, 11-year-olds, and I decided I was going to throw in a bit of complicated sentence structure for them by using when to join two clauses together. So things like, I feel happy when. And that was a very nice sort of awareness raising exercise. And we went through all the different emotions, and they then had to choose 5 that they wanted to write up, as it were. And it was interesting what they chose. I mean, some of them did choose sad, some of them did choose bored. most of them also chose happy or excited or whatever else. And then reflecting on what makes them happy or what makes them sad was really quite interesting. And then actually we then made that into display work. So they drafted it in their notebooks. I corrected any of the language, and then they made them into posters. And then they drew the pictures of the situations they were in when they felt these emotions. So that's up on the wall. It's just nice to have that reflection that they can do it.
Yeah, I think it's just quite important as well. Yeah,
8
because
years
you
old.
have to, if you can connect the vocabulary, the emotional vocabulary, with an activity in someone's L2, it's going to have a much stronger connection than it's just, how are you today? I'm fine, and you?
Yeah.
Fine has no meaning anymore.
Well, right. I mean, I have.
It's just I exist.
We've both had on our classroom walls, actually, haven't we? The Oh no, the classroom door. Sorry, the sort of about a dozen
different options. Yeah.
Right. So no, and I'll go and I'll open my classroom door and show them the poster and go, pick one of these.
You're not fine. You're one of these. Go. Yeah.
Yeah. Pick something more interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's been really fascinating. I mean, it's an area that I have an interest in, but not the kind of, I haven't read up on it like you have.
Mm-hmm.
But that's been really interesting for me. We're going to put the references and things. I think Alan's got probably a book list that he's going to share with you on the show notes.
Massive book list, which will be in the show notes, yeah.
And if you've got any ideas about what you do in the classroom to connect your learners with their emotions or what makes them feel certain things, then please do feel free to tweet at us or email us. The details are coming up in just a moment. Thank you for listening to another episode of Phrasally Verbocious. If you'd like to get in touch, you can tweet us
at PhrasallyV on Twitter.
You can email us
PhrasallyVerbocious@gmail.com.
You can check out our show notes online at
PhrasallyVerbociouspodcast.blogspot.com.
And please like, review and comment us on your podcast subscription service of choice. Goodbye.
Goodbye.